The next morning, I left the house at dawn and drove to Dad's place. It was a 6-hour trip through rural stretches and quiet back roads, and every mile gave me more space to process the fury and hurt seething inside me. When I finally arrived, the house stood proud at the end of a long gravel driveway. It was a modest 2-story brick home with neatly trimmed hedges and a small garage. I still recalled how Dad used to rant about the old plumbing and how he wanted to replace the roof shingles, but never got around to it. Now it felt odd knowing it belonged to me. I unlocked the front door, stepping into the silence of the living room with its faded couch and the coffee table Dad had built in his spare time. The faint smell of his cologne lingered in the air, mixing with the musty scent of a closed-up house. My chest tightened, torn between grief and relief. I spent the rest of that day wandering through every room, discovering remnants of my father's final years. I found a half-finished crossword puzzle on the dining table, an unpaid bill tucked under a stack of coupons, and his slippers by the back door. Everywhere I looked, I saw a piece of him. I found unopened mail, including a water bill and some promotional flyers, but nothing from my mother. That made sense, since they hadn't been in contact for years except for my sake. Yet, as I stood in his bedroom, taking in the worn edges of his favorite chair and the messy stack of magazines, I felt a pang of guilt for not being around more often. By nightfall, I sat at the kitchen table, the house deed laid out before me, along with the will and a few notes Ms. Garland had provided. The overhead light buzzed softly, illuminating the pages that declared me the sole owner of this property. My mother's callous words played in my mind on a loop. "You're never here anyway. My new stepkids need the space." I'd initially thought about selling this place because the memories might be too painful, but now I refused to even consider it. This house was mine, entrusted to me by Dad. It was the only tangible legacy he left, a testament to his love and faith in me. I wouldn't let my mother's indifference taint it. The following day, I called Ms. Garland to confirm all the legal steps needed to take possession. She was thorough, assuring me that there was no mortgage left to pay. Dad had settled it a year prior. I could keep it, rent it, or do whatever I pleased. After the call, I walked room to room, making a list of all the repairs. The place needed a fresh coat of paint, some updates to the plumbing, and a new water heater. There was also the matter of moving my own life here. I had a handful of things left, mostly in storage at my college apartment, since my mother had sold almost everything else. But no matter how sparse my belongings were, it felt good to imagine making this space truly mine. While I wandered upstairs, I stumbled on a locked drawer in Dad's old desk. Rifling through his closet, I eventually found a small key taped behind a row of ties. When I opened the drawer, I discovered documents going back years. Letters he'd saved, some from me when I was younger, some from friends and business associates, and others from a counselor. It became clear that my father had battled serious regrets over the divorce. There was also one letter, never mailed, addressed to me. It read, "I'm sorry for the times I wasn't there. I hope this house can be a real home for you, even after I'm gone. I want you to have what I never did, a sense of stability and belonging." By the time I finished, tears streaked my face. That letter was the closest thing to closure I'd ever get from him. I slept in his bed that night, the old sheets still smelling faintly of his aftershave. The house felt comforting, yet every time the floor creaked, I half expected him to walk in. My dreams were a disjointed mix of childhood memories and the recent confrontation with my mother. By morning, though, I awoke with a clearer resolve. I wouldn't let her wipe out my father's memory or treat me like disposable baggage anymore. I spent the next few days cleaning, decluttering, and slowly turning Dad's place into my own. The grief didn't vanish, but it became bearable in this quiet environment. I traded calls with Ms. Garland to finalize everything. When all was in order, I posted an online ad to sublet my college apartment. Then I steeled myself to return to my mother's house and gather what little remained of my belongings. I wanted to handle things logically, but I couldn't deny that a part of me craved retribution. She hadn't just hurt me, she had stomped all over my father's memory, and that was unforgivable. I arrived back late in the evening. The house smelled of new paint, which threw me off. The walls in the hallway had been repainted with bright, playful colors, no doubt for the stepkids who'd soon be moving in. My room was no longer my room at all. A bunk bed had replaced my old bed frame, and soccer posters lined the walls. My mother must have been redecorating while I was dealing with funeral arrangements. It made me dizzy with anger. The space that used to hold my favorite books and family pictures was now a testament to her new life. She wanted no trace of me left. She and Jeremy were watching TV in the living room when I walked in. My mother gave me a curt nod, but I ignored her and headed straight for the garage, hoping to find any of my belongings tossed there. I discovered a few random boxes, old school papers, some cheap decor items from my freshman dorm, and a dented suitcase with a broken zipper. Most of it was junk. Everything of real value, my clothes, my books, my photos, was gone. My chest tightened, but I refused to let anger paralyze me. Instead, I took out my phone, took pictures of everything, and made a mental note to document it. Eventually, my mother came in, arms folded. "What are you still looking for? I told you we cleared the clutter." I turned to face her. "You had no right to sell my things. Some of those items were sentimental, and you did it while I was burying Dad." She made an impatient gesture as though I were a pesky fly. "You needed to move on. This way, you can start fresh." I could have screamed at her, but instead, I drew a deep breath. "Well, here's the thing, Mom. Dad left me his house. I'm moving out for good." She stared at me as if I'd spoken in another language. What? "It's mine," I repeated slowly. "The house, everything. He left it to me in his will. I've already transferred the deed into my name." Her face flickered with a mix of shock and envy. "That can't be. Your father saved and bought that house himself after the divorce," I interrupted. "Legally, you have no claim to it. I just wanted you to know." I said it not to brag, but because I wanted her to understand I wasn't going to remain under her thumb. She tried to respond, but her lips only quivered in anger. Jeremy hovered at the door, looking uncomfortable, but saying nothing. I pushed past them, gathered my meager boxes, and hauled them to my car. The minute I drove away, I felt an unshackling, like a breath of fresh air. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of moving logistics and completing the formalities of Dad's estate. My mother never bothered to call me, which was just as well. I had no desire to speak to her either. I used what little savings I had to buy furniture for Dad's place, taking satisfaction in the idea of building a new life in a home she had no power over. Then one afternoon, just as I was hanging curtains in the living room, my phone buzzed with an unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something urged me to pick up. It was Jeremy. He sounded stressed, stumbling over his words. "Hey, kiddo," he began. "So, listen, your mom and I are in a bit of a predicament. The landlord is suddenly selling the house, and we need a place to stay. We were thinking, since your dad's place is big, maybe we could crash there for a while." I had to bite my lip to keep from laughing out loud. How quickly fortunes change. All that talk about me never being around, about needing space for the stepkids. Now they wanted a roof over their heads, specifically my father's roof. I couldn't imagine any scenario where I'd let them in, but part of me wanted to hear Jeremy out, to see if there was any remorse on my mother's side. "Let me think about it," I said, keeping my voice carefully neutral. "I'll call you back." I could sense his relief as he thanked me and hung up. I stared at the phone, my heart pounding. This was my chance to deliver the payback that brewed ever since I found out my belongings had been sold off like junk. I owed them nothing, absolutely nothing. My mother had never admitted she did wrong, nor had she apologized. Still, I decided to drive over to see the situation firsthand. If there was any humility or genuine remorse, I might at least listen. But if not, when I arrived at their place, I saw half-packed boxes in the front yard. Jeremy greeted me on the porch. He wore a defeated expression, but my mother was nowhere to be seen. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly. "They're selling the place out from under us. We can't afford a new rental with the kids on the way. Your mom thought, well, you know, family." Family. That word churned my stomach. I stepped inside to see my mother in the living room rummaging through a box of dinnerware. She paused when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. "I told him not to bother you," she said curtly, "but he insisted we ask. God knows we have nowhere else to go right now." I scanned the half-empty shelves. They definitely looked like they were in a bad spot, but I recalled all too well the night I returned from Dad's funeral and discovered my room gutted. How she'd sipped her tea and treated me like trash. I looked at her with a calm that even surprised me. "You sold my things without my permission," I said softly. You have never apologized or shown any regret. Now you want me to house you and your stepkids? Why should I?" She huffed as if annoyed at my nerve. "Why wouldn't you? I'm your mother. Don't you think it's your responsibility to help me out?" I let out a short, disbelieving laugh. "My responsibility? The way you helped me by throwing away my clothes and photos? The way you made room for your new family and erased me from the house I grew up in? Or the way you labeled Dad's place full of junk? You want a free ride, but you're not getting it from me." Jeremy cleared his throat. "We're in a tough spot. We'd pay rent or do something to help. Just give us a chance. We don't have anywhere else." I studied his face. He seemed genuine in his desperation, but I could still see a flicker of expectation. They assumed I'd cave because she was my mother, but years of emotional abuse, culminating in this final betrayal, had hardened me. Yet, I had an idea. They had taught me how little my feelings mattered when they needed something. This might be the moment to show them that actions have consequences. I leveled my gaze at Jeremy. "You can't stay for free. If you two move into my house, you'll be paying fair market rent. And there's a lease. I'll have a lawyer draft it." My mother snorted. "Don't be ridiculous. We're not paying you rent. That's outrageous. We're family." "Family?" I repeated, letting the weight of that word hang. "A family that sells each other's belongings? A family that disrespects each other's grief?" I shook my head. "If you think living under my roof entitles you to a free pass, you're mistaken. Either you pay rent or you find another place." My voice was calm, resolute. No trace of doubt. She shot me a venomous glare. "Fine, we'll see what we can do." Her pride wouldn't let her beg or back down in front of me, but I saw a flicker of uncertainty. She needed a place, yet despised the idea of paying me a cent. Jeremy attempted a fragile smile. "Thank you, we appreciate it. We'll pay what we can, as soon as we can." I nodded. "If you decide to move in, I'll send you the lease agreement. I'll require a security deposit as well." Then I turned on my heel and left before my mother could spit another insult. My hands trembled slightly when I reached my car, but I felt strangely triumphant. I'd taken back my power, refusing to be the doormat they expected. True to my word, I had Ms. Garland draft a lease. She raised an eyebrow when I told her who the tenants were, but didn't ask questions. Once the document was ready, I texted Jeremy to say I'd email it over. Days passed without a response. I assumed they were scrambling to find another option, presumably because paying me was insulting to my mother's ego. Then, a week later, Jeremy called back. "We'll sign the lease," he said. "We couldn't find anywhere else in our budget. We'll move in next week." His voice was subdued. I could sense my mother breathing heavily in the background, probably livid. Part of me felt a pang of pity for them, but it was overshadowed by my memory of losing every sentimental item I owned. On the day of their move, I waited at the house. I'd cleared out the master bedroom, for them, ironically, and moved my own belongings to a smaller room upstairs. The stepkids hadn't arrived yet. They were with their biological mom for a few more weeks, apparently. My mother and Jeremy pulled up in a rented truck packed with their furniture. She hopped out and inspected the house with an air of superiority, as if it was still her ex-husband's property. I kept my demeanor polite but distant. I'd posted the security deposit and first month's rent on a ledger, ready to accept payment. When she saw the makeshift desk in the living room with the paperwork, she frowned. "You're really doing this? A deposit and monthly rent? You can't cut us a break?" I gave her a stony look. "You didn't cut me a break when you sold everything I owned. So, no, you either pay or leave." Her nostrils flared. Jeremy intervened, stepping between us with a check. "Here's the deposit," he said quietly. "We'll get the rent in on time each month." I nodded, took the check, and handed them keys. "Your lease is 6 months to start. After that, we can renew or you can move on." Without another word, I headed upstairs. I had no intention of helping them unload. They were tenants to me now. Nothing more, nothing less. Over the following days, tension hung thick in the air. My mother rarely spoke to me, and when she did, it was dripping with annoyance. She'd grumble about how cold the house felt or how Dad had never bothered to fix the squeaky floors. But none of that changed the fact that she was living under my roof and paying me rent. Some might call my attitude cruel, but I felt justified. This arrangement was the direct result of her actions. She had ignored my emotional needs, sold my possessions, and had never shown remorse. Did she think I'd just forgive and forget? The real standoff began on a Tuesday evening, around 2 weeks after they moved in. I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, when my mother walked in and started complaining that the water pressure in the shower was low. She demanded that I call a plumber immediately. I was prepared to be cordial, but the way she addressed me, like I was beneath her, made my blood boil. "You're the landlord now," she snapped, "so fix it." I set down the spatula. "I'll handle it," I replied coolly, just like any landlord would, within a reasonable time frame. "But it's 8 at night. A plumber won't come out until tomorrow at the earliest." She slammed a cabinet. "This is ridiculous. I'm not paying rent for a house with shoddy plumbing." "Then feel free to move," I shot back, my voice clipped. "I didn't force you to sign the lease." Her eyes flared with rage, but she said nothing. Jeremy ambled in moments later, trying to diffuse the tension with a half-hearted joke, but it fell flat. He ended up giving me a half-apologetic shrug, as if to say he couldn't control her either. I supposed I couldn't blame him entirely for her behavior, but he'd stood by silently for years as she trampled my boundaries. Now, this was his reality as much as hers. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about the path I'd taken. I wondered if part of me was turning into the same cold creature she was. But then I remembered the heartbreak I'd endured, the father I'd buried, and the items I'd lost forever. I realized that my stance wasn't about cruelty, it was about self-respect. I wasn't punishing her for the fun of it. I was simply refusing to sacrifice my dignity for someone who never respected me. Days turned into weeks, and the tension continued. My mother never once apologized, but she had to abide by my rules and pay rent on time. She avoided me except for the occasional snide remark. Her stepkids finally arrived, 2 teenagers around 15 and 17. They were distant at first, confused about living in some strange house, but polite enough. I felt a bit sorry for them. It wasn't their fault. Yet, I maintained my boundaries, determined not to let sympathy erode my resolve. It wasn't until a month later that the final confrontation took shape. I woke up one morning to the sound of shouting downstairs. I threw on a sweatshirt and rushed down to find my mother cornering Jeremy in the foyer, demanding answers about money. The rent was due, and apparently, they were short. She whirled around and spotted me on the steps. "You," she spat, "you're taking advantage of this situation. This rent is outrageous, and we're not going to stand for it anymore." I folded my arms. "Outrageous? It's below market rate for a property this size. You could check listings in the area. You won't find anything cheaper." She jabbed a finger at me. "You wouldn't be acting this way if your father was still here. He would have helped me." A bitter laugh escaped my lips. "Dad is gone, and the only reason you're in this house is because I let you sign a lease instead of sending you packing. Don't try to guilt me using his name. You never cared about him anyway, not even when he died." Her eyes brimmed with fury, and I saw her chest heaving as she drew breath for what would surely be a spiteful tirade. But then, something unexpected happened. Her face crumpled, and tears welled in her eyes. She turned away, stalking into the living room to presumably gather herself. Jeremy stood there, looking helpless. His voice came out as a croak. "Can we have an extension on the rent? Just a week or two?" For a moment, I felt the old familiar tug of pity. But I remembered how she disrespected my father's memory. I remembered my lost possessions, memories I'd never get back. I forced myself to remain calm. "You'll have to pay the late fee as outlined in the lease if you're late. $100 for the first week, then it increases." I gestured at the contract pinned on the fridge. "You both signed it." He closed his eyes and nodded. I heard my mother's muffled sobs from the living room, but I refused to go to her. I'd spent too many years trying to appease her. Enough was enough. They coughed up the rent a few days later, albeit grudgingly. The stepkids avoided me as though I were the villain, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I had my own life to attend to, online classes, occasional freelance work, and the slow renovation of the house that Dad left me. Quietly, the days marched on, and the power dynamic had flipped for good. About 2 months after they moved in, on a gray Sunday morning, I was fixing a broken gutter outside when a car pulled into the driveway. Out stepped a man I'd never seen before, wearing a worn leather jacket. My mother rushed out of the house to greet him. Her demeanor was strange, flustered, yet determined. I hovered by the porch, curious. The man introduced himself as a real estate agent. "I heard you might be interested in selling?" he asked, his gaze flicking to me. She beckoned him inside, ignoring me completely. My heart thudded with an immediate spike of indignation. Sell? Was she planning to do something behind my back? I dried my hands and followed them in. The real estate agent looked from her to me, confused. I'm sorry, ma'am, but who's the property owner here? I stepped forward. That would be me. My mother turned sharply. But I explained to you on the phone, she snapped at the agent. It's my late husband's house. We're looking to get a fair appraisal to put it on the market soon. Let's not complicate matters. The agent's eyebrows shot up. He stared at her, then at me, clearly picking up on the tension. I set my jaw and forced a polite tone. My father left this house to me in his will. My mother rents from me. If she told you she's interested in selling, she's mistaken. She doesn't have the authority. He blinked rapidly, turning to my mother. Is this true? She swallowed, her face coloring with embarrassment. Well, we're family. I figured it would be a group decision. I shook my head, my heart pounding in my ears. You don't get to make decisions about my property. Unless you plan to buy me out, which you can't afford, you have no say. I gestured toward the front door. You can see yourself out, I'm not selling. The agent gave a polite nod and practically scurried away. My mother's eyes blazed once he was gone. How dare you humiliate me like that, she hissed. I'm your mother. You think you're so high and mighty because you've got a piece of paper saying this is yours. If not for me, you wouldn't even be here. It took every ounce of restraint not to lose my temper. No, if not for Dad, I wouldn't be here. You had your chance to show some respect for him when he died, but instead you sold everything that reminded me of him and forced me out of the house I grew up in. Now you want to sell the only thing he left me? No. Get this straight. This is my home, not yours. If you can't handle that, then pack your stuff and move. Her lips trembled. For the first time, she seemed truly at a loss for words. She stormed upstairs, and I heard a door slam. For a while, there was silence in the house except for the distant hum of traffic outside. Jeremy was nowhere to be found, probably at work. The Stepkids were out with friends, I presumed. And so I found myself alone in the living room, staring at family photos Dad had hung on the wall. Photos of me, of him, none of her. It spoke volumes about how their marriage had ended. That evening, she emerged, subdued, sullen, but not speaking to me. I overheard her complaining to Jeremy, something about me holding the house hostage. He didn't respond. Maybe even he'd grown tired of her manipulations. Life continued in strained coexistence until, one day, I noticed an online listing for a smaller rental apartment across town. The following morning, my mother and Jeremy began packing boxes. There was no announcement, no request to end the lease early. She simply started piling things into the car. She'd rather pay rent to a stranger, I realized, than keep living under my roof, under my terms. A savage part of me felt vindicated. I kept to myself as they moved out. When the last box was loaded, she marched up to me. We're leaving, she declared as if I should be devastated. I can't stand another minute in this place. I looked her in the eye, feeling nothing but calm. Suit yourself. You should know you're breaking the lease. I'm entitled to keep your deposit. I said it not to be petty, but to remind her that contracts matter, that every action has a consequence. She looked ready to spit nails. You're despicable! No more despicable than someone who sold her own child's belongings while he was at his father's funeral, I answered quietly. Now, you can either forfeit your deposit as the contract states, or pay the remaining month's rent. Your choice. Her face flushed, but she stayed silent. She knew I was right. Without another word, she stomped off to the car. Jeremy followed, looking like he'd aged a decade in a matter of months. The Stepkids sat in the back seat, gazing at me with curious, uneasy expressions. Moments later, the car reversed down the driveway, and just like that, they were gone. I shut the door, letting the silence of the house envelop me. A storm of emotion brewed in my chest: anger, relief, grief, and a strange sense of triumph. I wasn't proud of how messy it had all been, but I couldn't deny a deep satisfaction at having stood my ground. For years, I'd bowed to my mother's whims, believing she held all the power in my life. But Dad had gifted me not just a house, but a means to reclaim my dignity. In the days that followed, I walked through each empty room, reflecting on everything that had happened. Where once my mother and her husband cluttered the space with their tension and demands, now there was only calm. I opened the windows, letting fresh air wash away any lingering resentment. The ugly memories would stay with me forever, but they no longer had the power to define me. I had chosen not to forgive. That was my right. She'd never earned my forgiveness, and I felt no guilt for denying it. Late one evening, I sat at the kitchen table, the same spot where Dad's half-finished crossword puzzle had once rested. I was flipping through a photo album I managed to reassemble from digital backups friends had sent me. Though many physical prints were gone forever, I'd salvaged a few memories online. My phone buzzed, a text from Jeremy. It read, "We're settled in a new place. Sorry about everything. I hope you find peace." I stared at the screen, feeling a twinge of something, maybe the faintest sympathy for him, but I let the phone drop onto the table without replying. Apologies that come too late, and from the wrong person, aren't worth much. I thumbed through the photos again. Images of Dad laughing at a barbecue, me grinning beside him, my arms around his waist. He looked content, proud, perhaps hopeful for a future where we could share a real bond. I whispered a silent thanks, promising him I'd cherish this house and all his memories in it. And, in my own quiet way, I promised I'd protect myself from any more betrayal. The time for giving second chances was over. I was finally free. I ended up renting out one of the spare bedrooms to a college friend who needed a place. We turned the old basement into a small study area, repainted the living room in soft, warm colors, and replaced the worn kitchen linoleum with hardwood. Each step was like a cleansing ritual, a way of putting the past to rest. Every so often, I'd catch a glimpse of my mother's face in my mind, how she'd sneered at my father's memory, how she'd treated my belongings as disposable clutter. But the bitterness gradually receded. I wouldn't forgive her, but neither would I let her occupy every corner of my thoughts. One night, about a year later, I got a call from an unknown number. This time, I almost dismissed it, but ended up picking up again. It was my mother, her voice raspy and hesitant. She said she was outside, that she'd driven by and seen the lights on. My heart thundered. I hesitated, then told her she could come in for a moment. She walked in slowly, her eyes flicking around at the changes I'd made. She looked older, thinner, but still had that tough set to her jaw. "I don't want money," she said at once, as if expecting me to accuse her of it. "I just wanted to say I'm sorry your father passed and that you had to handle it all alone." I stayed quiet, wondering if she was fishing for some sort of absolution. After a moment, she continued, "I know I did some bad things. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I guess I wanted you to know I'm aware of it now. A part of me might have softened a year ago, but I changed." I crossed my arms, surveying her with measured composure. "I appreciate you saying that," I said softly, "but I'm not interested in reconciling, if that's what you're here for." She inhaled a shaky breath. "Fair enough." Then she glanced at the living room wall, at a framed photo of Dad. Her eyes watered. "He never deserved my anger. Neither did you." I didn't reply. An apology was better than nothing, but it wouldn't reverse the damage done. She stood there for a long moment, as if expecting me to say more. Finally, she nodded. "I'll leave now." Without ceremony, she stepped back out into the night. I locked the door behind her. A swirl of complicated emotions tore at me, but I felt no urge to open it again. She was too late. The lines had already been drawn. I turned off the lights, leaving only a soft glow in the hallway, and made my way upstairs. As I passed Dad's old desk, I ran my fingers along its smooth wooden surface. I imagined him smiling from wherever he might be, pleased that I'd protected his legacy and defended myself. In that moment, I felt a calm, unwavering certainty that I had done the right thing. Justice had been served in its own quiet way. I'd found a life, a home, and a sense of self-worth that no one could take from me again. I climbed into bed and let out a sigh, reflecting on the long road that had brought me here, how quickly life can shift, how betrayal can erupt from the person you once relied on the most, and how, sometimes, revenge doesn't have to be loud or dramatic. It can simply be standing tall in the face of those who wronged you, refusing to bend to their demands, and making them live with the consequences of their actions. I had chosen dignity and self-respect over misguided loyalty, and I would never regret it. I closed my eyes, letting the quiet hum of the house soothe me, secure in the knowledge that it was mine, and that at last, I was free.